You want to create visual interest in your paintings? Let me show you how, coming up. Let me show you the surface I'm going to paint on. It's going to be stretch canvas, and I've kind of textured it and colored it, and it's something totally different than what I normally do. So let's take a look at that first. So here's what I got going on. It's a 12 by 12 canvas. I've textured it at home with some acrylic paint, and here's the scene. Zoom in a bit. Something like in that area. Hey everyone, how's it going? So what I did with this piece was I took a canvas that had a little wiped out painting on it, and said, well, I'm going to try something new, and I took some acrylic paint, and with some putty knives and palette knives, I took a couple colors of some acrylic paint and mixed them up and applied them randomly over this surface, sort of randomly. To be fair, I kind of tried to create some structural elements to the look, anticipating I might paint an urban on it later. You obviously don't need to do that, and your color choices that you choose to do this with before you start could be, of course, informed by what you're going to paint over it, because you may leave some of that showing through. That's up to you. Now here I am using techniques I've used before in previous videos when I painted urban scenes, using my ruler to strike some key lines, perspective lines, and that sort of thing. Doesn't mean that I'll hold on to those too strongly, potentially. Just gives me some guidelines. Now, what was most interesting about using this pre-textured canvas was I knew that when I work on my panels, I have a lot more control over detail and that sort of thing with these urban pieces. But in this case, I really wanted to see how the brush dragged over the surface. I thought it could really play into the feeling of texture on the brick and that sort of thing. And I was actually amazed about how much sense of detail I could get working on this rough texture. And because of that rough texture, I'm using bristle brushes in this painting to save on the lifespan of my softer haired brushes. And also that'll facilitate, they're really good workhorses for working on a textured surface, but the way they hold paint, and you can drag and scumble easier with the bristle brushes, in my opinion, from my experience. And it's they're very useful for this particular surface. And again, just striking some more lines, getting some drawing elements down to facilitate later stages. Now when I'm starting the paint layers here, I am not using any turpentine. If I do at all, just a minuscule amount to get the paint a little workable, but I don't want it runny at this stage. I want to have that dry paint to scumble over the texture. Now in the beginning stages, I'm just using chromatic black from Gamblin and white to create some value, leaving some of the paint thin. You can see some of the layers probably coming through. And of course we'll do detail shots later, but this will just kind of establish some primary lights and darks in the composition to get the bones in before the light changes. And so I'm not chasing shadows and that sort of thing, but I love doing these industrial pieces, urban type work, really. And this is the first time I've used this textured toned surface, and I'm kind of liking it so far. It really adds to the feel of the scene. So I think I might take some of my panels at home that I have just toned with a wash of burnt umber and texture them up a bit. I'm really liking this. Now for this surface, I'm using bristle brushes to save my better synthetic brushes, because their surface is pretty rough. When I put in some final layers is when I'll bring out my nicer, softer brushes. And even though I've sketched in some shapes, I paint through them now so that I'm not nitpicking around shapes, and I'll reestablish the smaller shapes later. Always look for the big shapes first and then break it down from there. Yes, I can't stress that enough. It's very important to just work with the bigger shapes first. Number one, that's really going to, when you get your compositional elements in there, that's really going to tell you right off if you're on track to achieve the goals you want to achieve in your painting. You could obviously, everyone proponents of the doing thumbnails beforehand and such. I personally just like to jump into painting. I have a pretty good idea when I see a scene how I might want to construct it. And both methods are useful, so whatever works for you. And a lot of times I just don't, because I'm really, lighting conditions are pretty fast moving, so I want to get right to it. And sometimes you pay the price for that, and sometimes you don't. Same with, even if you made a thumbnail, it doesn't guarantee you're going to end up with a successful painting. So there's lots that goes into making a painting. Okay, I'm still working with the bristle brushes and getting some thicker paint in certain areas, and then we'll proceed to finer details. Light changes fast in the morning, so the cast shadow patterns have changed dramatically after only half an hour. So yes, they do change very fast, so it's important to get down some elements so you don't chase the light. You don't want to have different angles of light. You really want to pay attention, and it's a matter of time that you'll pick up on that, and you'll see areas that number one, you want to capture the striking light and shadow that attracts you to the scene, but you got to watch out for little supporting actors in the scene that you don't realize over time as you're painting show up in sunlight, because previously they were in shadow, and then you want to really try to hone in on the elements that are critical, so that you don't have any discrepancies in your lighting and your painting, if you're painting realistically, of course, like I am. Now you can see there where I started putting in the graffiti that was on the wall there, and it just wasn't working out. Part of it was the too much wet paint in the red area, and I just wasn't liking the result that I was achieving. And honestly, when I started to really look at the graffiti as I was painting it, I really wasn't into it. So I just might steal some graffiti that I've taken at the train yard. That's something I recommend too if you're taking reference photos for your paintings. I sometimes will collect material because I may be doing an urban scene where I want to interject more elements that are not in the original scene but will add to the story. So I have files on my computer of different graffiti that I could insert onto that wall to show the feel, the space that it was. So that's something to be creative about. You know, you don't have to hold to the scene that you're painting. You know, we always edit anyway with different elements in the painting. Now you can see how I painted those stairs. Rather than, I painted the lighter shape first and worked in the darker little elements, and thus it reveals the tread of the stairs, which is a nice little effect. I like how that turned out. And then you can see previously when I drew through shapes how I reestablished that vertical post in the stair area. Here I am working on a little exterior light there. I made sure to mix up some paint, and I make sure when I put the stroke down, I'm deliberate with the stroke. You don't want to noodle around. There's white paint under there, and you don't want to disturb that too much. Now here I'm very lightly dragging some kind of staining, using a little darker tone, of course, and just scumbling lightly over that wet paint layer to suggest the staining on the building wall, and it worked out pretty well. Pretty happy with it. Now something else you can try with this technique of pre-texturing your canvas is maybe you come up with some reference material, whatever it is, from a sketch, a painting, whatever, and you can texture your painting ahead of time in the areas where you find it very critical for what you want to paint, rather than randomly doing it and then just working something on top of it. So that's something else to experiment with. And to not feel like you're wasting materials or something if you don't normally work this way, is you could just take some, go to Michael's or wherever when they have sales, and buy some cheap little 8x8 canvases or something and practice on those. I wouldn't suggest trying to do any good finished paintings on products such as that. I would really highly recommend researching making your own surfaces, and I plan on doing a video soon on how I prime my own panels, for instance. But that's a later video. So you gotta have a play date and learn and explore and see how it feeds into your creative interests for what you want to paint. I think the one challenge with an idea like this is some people can just take off running and get caught up in the little technique, and that can be a challenge if you're not careful. It becomes a little gimmick, like a little crutch you hang an image on, and your story, your message can be lost in what you're trying to paint. So you just want to really reflect on that and don't use it as, try to avoid gimmicks. You want to be honest and authentic in your work. And this is just one way you can see if it feeds into what you want to do creatively. So something to think about for sure. Okay, I'm calling it quits. The clouds are in and out and the light has changed dramatically. I think it got a pretty good start. It was more of an experiment to try to see what's like painting on the surface that you saw in the beginning. And it was very interesting. I think I might pursue that in future paintings. But let me show you what I got. So this is what this session ended with. I've been at it about, I don't know, almost an hour and a half. And I do like the textures. If you let me pan in here, see the way the brush dragged over the surface was very interesting. Color wise, I'm not super happy with it, but you know what, it's okay. I got some values that are working, and I think it can be enhanced upon in the studio, so we'll do that. Okay, so that was an interesting experiment, working on the pre-textured surface that I did at home. I used acrylic paint, and what that caused was the surface, once it was dry, was kind of a little bit slick when I applied paint over it. That can be good and bad. Good for the, you get some translucency to your paint film that you're applying over that. Right. But it was a test, and it has some potential. I think it's something you have to work with for quite a while, so glad I tried it, and I hope you enjoyed the little experiment. And thanks for hanging out, and until the next video, bye.